I'm deeply grateful to Norm and Constance Rice, and I don't know, I want to make public that they've supported the center, not only with words, but with money. They donated to the Killinger chair that I occupy, and for which I am deeply grateful. So they've really walked the commitment. Professor Linda Darling Hammond, when I asked her, I said, Linda, I want you to be there when I do my last dance. She said, Jim, I will. And she has consistently been a strong supporter of the center. But first of all, let me tell you who she is, as if you don't know. Professor Linda Darling Hammond is president and CEO of the Learning Policy Institute and the Charles Ducommun Professor of Education Emeritus at Stanford University, where she founded the Stanford Center for Opportunity Policy and Education and served as the faculty sponsor of the Stanford Teacher Education Program, which she helped to redesign. She currently serves as the chair of California's Commission on Teacher Credentialing. Professor Darling Hammond is a past president of the American Educational Research Association and recipient of its award for distinguished contributions to research, lifetime achievement, research review, and research to policy. She is also a member of the American Association of Arts and Sciences and of the National Academy of Education. From 1994 to 2001, she was executive director of the National Commission on Teaching in America's Future, whose 1996 report, What Matters Most, Teaching for America's Future, was one of the most influential reports affecting U.S. education in that decade. In 2006, Professor Darling Hammond was named one of the nation's 10 most influential people affecting educational policy. In 2008, she served as the leader of President Barack Obama's educational policy transition team. She began her career as a public school teacher and co-founded both a preschool and a public high school. She served as director of the Rand Corporation's education program and as an endowed professor at Columbia University Teachers College before coming to Stanford. She has consulted widely with federal, state, and local officials and educators on strategies for improving educational policies and practice, and is the recipient of 14 honorary degrees in the US and internationally. Among her more than 500 publications and a number of award-winning books, including The Right to Learn, Teaching as the Learning Profession, Preparing Teachers for a Changing World, and The Flat World in Education, which, by the way, is the TC series of books that I edited, another favor she did for me. Since this center was founded, Professor Darling Hammond has been one of its strongest, its most eloquent supporters. As you can see in our souvenir program, she gave a Center Symposium lecture in 1994. She gave the keynote address in the Center's 20th anniversary conference, which launched the Encyclopedia of Diversity in Education. And of course, she's giving the opening keynote address in this final symposium that I will organize for the center. I invited Linda to give the opening keynote in this conference because of my deep admiration for her work, our friendship, and the values that she exemplifies. She walks the talk. Linda.
Well, I don't know what, I should just sit down after that introduction. It's hard to meet that bill. But I want to thank my dear friend Jim Banks and acknowledge as well his heart and intellectual companion, Sherry Banks, also a dear friend, for the invitation and for his courageous and groundbreaking work over so many years, since 1992 here when the center was founded, but years before that as well. This just provides a small glimpse of his contributions. Jim, as you know, is widely recognized as the father of multicultural education for his pioneering research and distinguished contribution to the development of the field. His own prodigious writing has conceptualized the field of multicultural education and its meanings for teaching, learning, and for citizenship. In addition, he has pulled together multiple handbooks, encyclopedias, and other gigantic volumes, which have collected the leading authors and works to define and advance the field for thousands of readers. And his students, of course, are carrying forward this work. When Jim and I talk, I can't tell you how many times he's told me, oh, I'm finishing this handbook. I'm never going to do another handbook. Never going to do another handbook. Thankfully, he breaks his promise regularly, and he has continued. His work has been critically important in the U.S. in moving us from a marginalizing framework for education to one that recognizes and values pluralistic and multicultural views, realities, and people. It has also engaged this work worldwide. When his students and mentees and colleagues stood up, you could see the reach into all parts of the world. Thankfully, Jim has continued to use his prodigious energy in this regard. And I'll just point out some of the international work that has come about just in the last few years. The Citizenship, Education, and Global Migration book that that AERA published in 2017, which looks at civic education courses and programs as nations around the world are developing civic participation skills and that reflect cultural, national, and global identities. This deals with supports for minoritized and marginalized groups in 18 nations around the world. Jim mentioned the Encyclopedia of Diversity in Education, which has a 4-volume set of 700 signed issues, entries with the full spectrum of diversity issues, race, class, gender, religion, language, exceptionality, and the global dimensions of diversity as they relate to education. Also recent, the Routledge International Companion to Multicultural Education, again, which uses case studies from the US, Europe, Asia, Africa, South and Central America, dealing with everything from curriculum reform, immigration and citizenship, language, religion, the education of cultural minority groups, among many other topics. It just gives you a little bit of what he's just been doing lately. I'm hopeful that while he's traveling around in his so-called retirement, he will also continue to break his promises to never do another major work again. Jim is driven to educate all members of the world and to understand and appreciate one another, to actualize the human potential each of us possesses individually and the even greater potential we activate when we can act in concert collectively. Jim says he is retiring, as I noted, and I know there's a Paris trip in their future, and my husband and I have spent time in Paris with Jim and Sherry and hope to do that again next year. But I think we will be seeing some other products that emerge between the travels and the grandson and the exciting work that's ahead. I could not be more pleased that my dear friend and former student and colleague Django Paris will be taking up this mantle. Woo! It is such a good genealogy. As you know, that Django, like me, is a former English teacher. His research and teaching focuses on understanding language and literacies and lifeways among youth of color in the context of demographic and social change. His work on culturally sustaining pedagogies is extremely important work. Pedagogies that allow all of us to be who we are, to build on our knowledge and experience in our learning, and to share who we are with others to enhance their learning, which in turn enhances our shared humanity and capacity to know more and to get along. You know, the earliest universities were grounded in diversity. If you think back to Timbuktu in Africa, the whole idea was to bring people together from all over the world in order to ground knowledge in the various experiences and knowledge that people had. That was the whole point, that growing knowledge relied on diversity of experience, perspective, and thought. Diversity and the capacity to seek out and learn from diversity is fundamental to human advancement and survival. But people can't learn from and benefit from diversity if they are afraid of it, blind to its value, or outright opposed due to ignorance, prejudice, or bias. The violence, strife, and too frequent genocide that results from this fear, blindness, and ignorance is a blight on our world and a growing blight in our own society. The need for understanding and appreciation of diversity is greater now than ever. And I think we have all experienced over the last year and a half since President Trump's election, the ways in which diversity is threatened in this country. Very shortly after the election, reports of swastika graffiti and racial slurs in schools having risen was reported. A high school student in Shasta, California handed out deportation letters to students of color in his school and videotaped himself doing it to post on YouTube. Kids in Queens, New York told children of color to sit in the back of the bus because Trump was now president. Mexican and other immigrant families afraid of deportation sometimes chose to deport themselves. ABC News ran a segment on hate in schools. They showed Michigan middle school students chanting "Build That Wall" during lunchtime. They showed a new graffiti on a Minnesota school bathroom door, #White America. 3 students were suspended from school in Pennsylvania after marching through the halls with a political sign chanting "White Power." On another school wall, it said, "Black lives don't matter and neither does your vote." In Skokie, Illinois, a 9th grade public school science teacher, Hillary Tully, overheard this question coming from one of her students: "Is it okay to burn Jews?" One student apparently just thought that Jews deserved to burn. The other 2 disagreed. "I've been a teacher for 24 years, Tully said, and I've never heard that kind of talk before. We can take heart in the widespread reactions and pushbacks to the hate agenda. In this last year, the hundreds of thousands of people who have turned out to march, to advocate, to tweet, and many other things. Black Lives Matter, Sanctuary Cities, the women's marches, March for Our Lives, millennials rejecting the divides as well as the violence that has increasingly characterized the American way of life. We can take heart in the fact that every major social change has been preceded by extreme events and challenges that got people woke. If you think back to the eras of change, you know, it's not a steady path to progress. It is 2 steps forward and 1, sometimes 1.5 steps back before we have that opportunity to move forward again. Enslavement and the Civil War was turned into Reconstruction. When Black legislators were elected, who created the first public education systems in the South and enacted other progressive legislation. Of course, there was the Jim Crow pushback that occurred then, but people pushed forward, and there was another era of rebirth in the 1920s The Great Depression was turned into a progressive era for racial and economic breakthroughs that ultimately got us to Brown versus Board of Education. In the 60s, the vicious assassinations of JFK, Malcolm X, Medgar Evers, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King led to the Voting Rights Act, the War on Poverty, the Great Society, and the opportunities that produced the black middle class today. As Frederick Douglass understood, there cannot be progress without the roar of the waters, that progress requires struggle and grows from it. Today's affront to all people of goodwill can lead to a coming together to take back our country, and the impulse to come together in this way. This work is not easy. The work of building understanding and appreciation among people for each other, and to be able to work, live, and learn together, to benefit from the diversity that must inform all growth in knowledge, is a struggle. It's not a straight line to victory, but the arc of the moral universe does bend toward justice, and the path to a multicultural world is part of that arc. I would offer this advice to those carrying on Jim's legacy here from my favorite poet, Langston Hughes, who put it this way: America is a dream. The poet says it was promises. The people say it is promises that will come true. The people do not always say things out loud, nor write them down on paper. The people often hold great thoughts in their deepest hearts, and sometimes only blunderingly express them, haltingly and stumbling put them into practice. The people do not always understand each other, but there is somewhere there always the trying to understand and the trying to say, you are a man, you are a woman, together we are building our land. America, land created in common, dream nourished in common, keep your hand on the plow, hold on. If the house is not yet finished, don't be discouraged, builder. If the fight is not yet won, don't be weary, soldier. The plan and the pattern is here, woven from the beginning into the warp and woof of America. All men are created equal. No man is good enough to govern another man without that other's consent. Better die free than live slave. Who owns those words? America. Freedom, brotherhood, democracy. A long time ago, an enslaved people heading toward freedom made up a song. Keep your hand on the plow, hold on. That plow plowed a new furrow across the field of history. Into that furrow, the freedom seed was dropped. From that seed, a tree grew, is growing, will ever grow. That tree is for everybody, for all America, for all the world. May its branches spread and its shelter grow until all races and all people know its shade. Keep your hands on the plow. Hold on. Thank you.
We're going to let Linda conduct our own Q&A, and there are mics that Robert and Amber will make sure you get your mic. Okay, please stand, and they'll bring you a mic.
And please identify yourself when you, some of you I know, some of you I'm eager to know.
Takes one to start.
Hi, Brian Bird, Iowa State University, assistant professor. Thank you again. What would you say are some of the enduring challenges for the next generation of scholars?
Wow, that's a big order. Given the state of the world, there are so many. You know, I am personally a scholar activist. I want to see the results in the world of the thinking and the work that we do. And I do think that we know a lot in the academy about how people learn, about how to support healthy development for young people, both to do that for different groups of young people and to do that for groups of young people in school together. That is not part of the way in which public officials often think about creating policies that influence schools, allocating funding that goes to schools, designing and adopting programs. So I would say, of course, there's always more to learn in that regard about how we can educate young people well. But I would also say it is an important challenge for the next generation of scholars to find ways to communicate more effectively with those who make the decisions about what happens in schools on a wide scale. We are in the academy encouraged to write our findings up and put them in journals that are peer-reviewed journals for the research profession primarily. That's a good thing to do. Don't hear me as saying don't do it. Get tenure, keep tenure, keep getting promoted. However, we also need to be publishing in ways that reach the practice community. We need to be talking to the folks who are, whether they're state superintendents and Department of Education officials, or whether they are in administration in school districts, or whether they are mayors or governors, as I often do, about the ways in which to think about the problems that face them. So I would encourage that. In many countries, and some of you may have experience of this in the countries you're from, there are journals that are shared between researchers and practitioners, that practitioners contribute to as they do action research themselves, that scholars contribute to. There are research conferences. I know this is true because I was at one in Singapore recently and in Ontario, Canada, where practitioners and researchers come together by the thousands every year and talk about the work that they are together doing to figure out how to improve schools. So I think that is an agenda for us to really carry the work into the field where it can have the effects that we want it to have.
Hello, I'm Craig Lewis. I'm the Academic Program Director for Western Washington University's Outreach Program in Everett. I teach undergraduate and graduate seminars on diversity and equity. And one of the things I struggle with, if I have students for a long time, I can eventually get them there, but if I'm dealing with issues of race or gender in discrimination, sometimes there's a tension between the two. People feel that if you pay too much attention to this, you're not paying attention to that. Is there a way that you can, a sentence or two that would kind of open a door to seeing the connection between, if you fix it for this group, you're fixing it for this one too, and we're all in this together? It's getting past that initial reaction that I struggle with lots of times.
I teach teachers, so this is a central issue in the preparation of teachers. And in a number of courses in the Stanford program, we try to help people think about the ways in which identities are both developed and centered or marginalized in different contexts for a range of identities, right? Not to set an equivalence of the experience, but to help people see that there are multiple ways in which the way in which you understand diversity and the way in which you center each other in various identities can matter. Rather than kind of trying to say, we're going to do a few weeks on gender and a few weeks on race and a few weeks on something else, we try to really give a conceptual framework for the ways in which identities are both constructed and in which they are perceived in society. The social identity threat issue can be a good lead-in to that, the ways in which society constructs and responds to identities, a range of identities, whether that is, and then the ways in which individuals, experience that. So that there's a broader framework within which people can then take up the issues that are really important. The other thing, of course, is that it's hard for people to understand things they haven't themselves experienced. So, I always go back to Dewey's experience in education. It's important for people to have experiences and to see what the experiences are. Sometimes that may not be true for undergraduates in that context, but sometimes in professional context, it can be through carefully constructed fieldwork experiences. It can be through various kinds of observations and case studies. It can be sometimes through video representations, but trying to help people not just hear words and read texts, but also change the way in which they know the world and they know the experiences of other people. That can be helpful.
Thank you. My name is Lindsay Thomas, and I'm a graduate student at Antioch University, Seattle, in the clinical psychology department. I am curious about the role of social identity privilege and what role teachers and other educational professionals might have in acknowledging those locations in this work as we move forward and educate new generations.
And you're talking about a privilege that educators themselves may hold, or a privilege that may be operating in classrooms among different students, or both?
Both.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
I shouldn't have asked that question because that just expands the range of the answer. Well, one of the things that I think we're beginning to recognize in preparation of educators is how important it is to delve into identity questions and social emotional learning questions for educators themselves, right? Because we all arrive wherever we arrive in education from whatever our personal experiences were, and those need to be really thought about and taken up. So I think it's really important for work to go on with educators about what privilege means, and also how you can use privilege productively on behalf of a social justice agenda. My students and I in STEP wrote a book together called Learning to Teach for Social Justice, and it takes up these issues quite a bit in terms of what they were trying to come to understand about their own role in addressing these kinds of issues. In classrooms, of course, social identity operates. There's a lot of evidence, that teachers respond intuitively to some kids and not others. There are studies about how white boys in particular get like 3 times more attention than anybody else in classrooms when they go ooh, ooh, or partly because they're active and partly because there may be some responsiveness built into social identity ways of working. That's certainly not true in all classrooms, but there was a little basket of studies that were done over a number of years on who gets called on and that kind of thing. There's a new set of studies about how important teachers of color are for students of color. Having just one teacher of color in the early elementary years produced substantial gains in graduation rates and achievement for a group of students. And there are several other studies, and I reflected on that because my own children had that experience. Faye Freeman in the 3rd grade, I just want to call her name, and Evelyn Jenkins Gunn in the 9th grade, and I thought about, well, why is that? Well, they were completely comfortable in knowing that they were being affirmed, they were getting the kind of encouragement that they needed. They could have gotten it and did get it from some other teachers as well. So I don't think that that's only from teachers of color, but I think it's flagging something that goes on both around the sort of seeing yourself in your teacher, but also around the affirmations that are being given. Faye Freeman got more of her kids, black, white, and every other ethnic background, into the gifted and talented program the next year than any other teacher. She was doing that for all her kids. So it was a stance of affirmation and support. So I think that being able to help do that for all the kids in the classroom, to really be deliberate about saying, I'm going to be sure that the affirmation and the recognition and the interaction is going to go to all of the kids, and maybe a little more to those who might need it more because they're coming from potentially negative affirmations or negative experiences is another way. There's a wonderful practice called complex instruction, which is a collaboration tool for cooperative learning in classrooms that Rachel Lotan and Elizabeth Cohen developed at Stanford, several books on it. But there's a practice in that way of doing cooperative learning of status recognition or a status treatment, where if a kid is being marginalized in the classroom and the teacher is always looking out to see whether kids are being marginalized, whether it's by virtue of race or disability status or language background or whatever it might be, they actually have a way to give them a status treatment, to raise them up with affirmations, public affirmations about their competence, areas of competence that can then become more visible, to change the playing field. So many, many things that can be done, and building that into the way we help teachers come into the profession can make a big difference for their students.
Hi, my name is Renee Shank, and I am the program director for the new bilingual teacher certification program here at the University of Washington. And I am also a former student of Dr. Banks and a teacher educator here in the multicultural secondary teacher ed courses. And one of the things that I've noticed in this post-Trump or Trump era or post-election era is a sense of blind urgency on the part of our candidates to fight the fight. And it's actually been really hard to manage as a teacher educator. So I'd love to hear any advice you have as teacher educators in this era, how we can control the urgency to ensure that we're actually training well our candidates to go out into the field and to do right by our students, both by preparing them academically, but to be social activists as well.
So I have not had your experience, so you'll have to tell me what you mean by this, the concern you have about urgency.
As my colleague Gonzalo Guzman says, our candidates are so woke that they cannot sleep. So the hypercriticality of us as teacher educators, of the system, of the program, that they don't want to even engage in the methodological training.
Ah, okay.
To do that.
Now I get it. Yeah, you want to be woke in many ways, and part of the ways people need to be woke is they need the skills and the tools, because just going into the classroom with Mau is not enough to actually enable kids to learn effectively. And that's been an issue in this field for a long time, that people may have beliefs and passions, but they don't have the tools to ensure that a kid who, as I experienced as a high school teacher, maybe a 12th grade kid who doesn't know how to read yet, you don't have those skills to teach that student to read. Your social justice beliefs are not really worth a lot in changing the trajectory of their life. You don't have the skills to ensure that English learners are both preserving their own languages and building on those to, master English. You're not going to help them with what they need to be doing in life. So I think, frankly, my own view is that that's a good lecture to give at the beginning of a teacher education program. That this is about giving you the skills and the tools, the knowledge that you need to do the job that you're beliefs and value system make you want to do. But if you don't have those tools, and we see this all the time. In fact, I think there's been an inaccurate view that the main job is to change people's beliefs. But beliefs slip as soon as they encounter a reality that you don't know how to interact with. And we see this all the time, young teachers coming out, yeah, I'm gonna change the world, and they're like, oh, I don't know what to do about this kid. And then they revert to whatever was their experience in their own household or their own school experience. The biases that they didn't believe they had come straight to the surface. It can't be their fault, it has to be the child's fault. We know that when teachers are underprepared methodologically, they're more likely to send kids out of the classroom, they're more likely to engage in exclusion. That often happens to be disproportionate by race, et cetera. So I would just put it out there and say, you need these tools to do the social justice work that you want to do. And these will be as important to you as every commitment that you hold. There's one there and there's one over here too, in the blue dress here.
Hi, I'm Enrique Suarez. I'm a postdoc here in the College of Ed. Oh. Hi, sorry about that. Enrique Suarez, postdoc here in the College of Ed. And you talk a lot about communities and social emotional learning, and I was wondering how you made sense of the role that love, caring, and compassion play in our, in education in general, in teacher education, and thinking about raising our colleagues' racial critical consciousness and just teaching and learning in general.
Thank you. I think love, caring, and compassion are at the root of teaching. And we shouldn't be ashamed to talk about love. Sometimes once I gave a talk about that, I mentioned love, and somebody came running up to me and said, "You said it out loud." It's like, oh my God. So we need to bring love out of the closet, and compassion and caring. The other thing though is that again we need to give people tools and structures in which they can love and care effectively. And I have strong connections to that from my own beginning teaching experiences, where I was in big factory model high schools, 180 kids at a time. I cared about my students deeply, but I could not come to know that number of kids deeply. The structure of the school was not designed to allow me to do all that I wanted to do. Each teacher was doing their own thing in their own island. There were no teams. There were no opportunities for teachers to share together how they were working with kids. I didn't have all of the tools that I needed to do that. So we need to combine those together. I remember actually the young man who was sitting in my 12th grade classroom, and I figured out he couldn't read. And I loved that young man and cared for him, but I didn't have the tools to express that love in a way that would help him. I remember the young man who came into my classroom. I got the kids, of course, in my first year of teaching who had failed English the year before, because who else would you give them to but the beginning teacher. And one young man wrote in the tiniest possible script. You had to use a magnifying glass to read it. But he started writing, and he was a brilliant writer. And I would get my magnifying glass out, and he started to come to class regularly. He started to write extensively, and he was really turning around. And one of the places where I was investing a lot of energy, he stopped coming to school one day, and I couldn't figure out what happened. Called his home, couldn't get an answer, trying to chase him down, et cetera, went to the office. First they didn't seem to know. Finally I found out that he had been expelled for substance abuse, and they didn't even bother to tell me. So this is what happens in a factory model school. You could be pouring your heart out, and the school is doing its own thing. And the fact that you might want and need a relationship with your students isn't part of the way we think about this. So actually when I was at Stanford, and Django participated in this, we created a school at the request of a nearby community, East Palo Alto. It had been 100% black, and it lost its high school during desegregation in 1975. The kids were bussed out to other schools across a big highway, and 2/3 of them were not graduating. So the superintendent of the elementary school district came to us and said, can you start a high school in the community so that we can keep our kids in the community and see if we can get them to graduate? And we created a small high school in which there were teams of teachers working with kids. Often the teams then would go from the 9th to the 10th grade with the kids when that was possible. Advisories were established. Every kid had an advisor who stayed with them for all 4 years. The advisors had 15 kids in good fiscal years and 20 kids in bad fiscal years, but they had a small number of kids. They met with the families, they made positive phone calls home at the beginning of the school year to each of their advisees' parents, started that relationship, met with the parents in home visits or at the school at the parents' request before the first month of school was out. The kids did student-led conferences with their parents. They had each other's cell phones. The kids had an advocate. Anything that happened, the advisor was there to check on their homework, make sure they got the extra help, ensure that if there was a behavioral issue that came up, there was attention to that with knowledge of the student's situation. And that was very important because this is a community that was the murder capital of the US in 1992. Drive-by shootings were common, evictions, incarceration, substance abuse gangs, etc. But over time, by putting those pieces in place, by explicit social and emotional learning in advisories, with mindfulness, with communications and engagement with parents who did engage with the school, family members, it might not be a parent, might be an uncle, aunt, grandmother, and so on. An environment with love, caring, and compassion at its core, and structures that enabled the staff to express those effectively. Really changed the zeitgeist, and it became a school where, even though the first year, of course, as you can imagine, there were fights and graffiti and gang violence and so on, it got to the place where there were no incidents on campus, where the kids would tell us that we are a family. Across, at that point, it was now Latino, African American, and Asian Pacific Islander students. There were no racial divides because we got rid of the tracking that inadvertently occurred when we had the Spanish speaking kids in a Spanish for Native Speakers class that produced a tracking system. Oh, there's my daughter. So we got rid of the tracking system and ensured that kids would be together. So, this is a work in progress, but 90% of the kids were graduating, 90% going on to college. We had our first graduate go to Stanford undergrad just about a year or two ago. And that was because we thought about how do you enable teachers to have that caring and compassion and love at the center with supports. I'm fine. We'll just go till.
I'm Sarah Cavanaugh. I'm a former and forever mentee of Dr. Banks, and now at the University of Pennsylvania.
Lucky you.
And I found myself sitting here turning over and over again in my head the list of really extreme hate speech incidences in schools with children that you mentioned during your talk, the hashtag White America and the chanting white power in the hallway, and thinking about the tension that the educators in those buildings must feel between the need to indicate to the students of color at that school that their humanity isn't up for debate,
Right.
and the need to teach these students who hold these extreme and hateful beliefs to change their minds. And discipline often doesn't change people's minds. And I wonder if we're in a moment where we have to really think about how do we engage with the vast number of people in this, children in this country, who hold very strong racist, heterosexist, xenophobic beliefs in a way that thinks about learning and not just about discipline. How do we change minds, really change hearts and minds, at the same time as protecting the students these children who are being racist are putting the humanity of their fellow students up for debate? That seems like a very difficult thing to do both at the same time.
Yeah. It's a great question. And, the answer takes us right back to why we're here. In a number of those schools, what they have responded with is really developing and planting a strong multicultural curriculum that wasn't there before, right? Because it was just like off the table. And during the No Child Left Behind years, it got even worse in terms of the nature of curriculum in some schools because it was all about reading and math test prep with the kind of text that were going to appear on the test, not the range of text that you would want kids to be reading and thinking about and engaging in, or the kind of social emotional development strategies that help build empathy and perspective taking and knowing about other points of view. And so a number of schools have really backed up and rethought the curriculum and begun to really engage. They're using teaching tolerance has had a huge increase in the use of its materials. Facing History has the same, but then all kinds of multicultural programs and materials are being used. And I think over time, if that's infused from the beginning, if you don't have to be the parent who on the diversity committee who says, hey, let's look around at what's being done here. I just was talking to one of my good friends who's a dean at another university who's got a little child coming through school, and we're just, in many schools, we're still back where we were in 1960 something, beginning to advocate both for the representations, for the nature of the texts that are selected, the nature of the teaching that goes on, the activities that engage students in seeing and understanding each other in a variety of ways. I think that is the answer ultimately, rather than discipline. It is being taken up again. It was pushed to the margins for a period of time, and this is a really important moment to help schools center that, deeply important way of teaching and a set of resources for teaching.
My name is Jennifer Indo. I'm the program manager for the program here.
I didn't hear your name.
Jennifer Indo. I'm the program manager for the Danforth Educational Leadership Program here at UW. Help train teachers to be principals and program admins. So my question today, actually, as I'm hearing the talk, and actually what struck me in the beginning is there are a lot of firsts. The first African American professor in the College of Education in this position. And what strikes me, coming back to the program and thinking of my current students, and forgive me, I may be young, and I know that it's 2018, and I may be impatient, although I continue to feel as though I keep hearing, I am the first. I am the first Latina professor, or I am the first African American superintendent. I am the first Latino principal in Bellevue. So that brings me to my question. How do we support our teachers, our leaders of color, who are coming up and who are wanting to do more, while at the same time we are working with our white counterparts who are still reading for the first time, unpacking the white knapsack of white privilege, and it's 2018. We want to do this work in compassion. We want to open up avenues of discussion. We want to stay woke. We want to use our tools to be effective. But I feel as though, especially in the Trump era, we are frustrated as leaders of color, and we can at times be very passionate, and it may come out not as the most effective way of leading in a discussion. So that being said, bringing it back to my question, how do we open up that dialogue? How do we take care of our leaders of color, make sure that we're retaining them, making sure that we are not relegating those positions of they are multicultural teachers, or they are going to be the ones who are only going to be dealing with disciplinary actions, but instead they're being tapped to be in principal programs, and then not pulling on, but we are working with our other counterparts to pick up that work and to take it on first and to start leading out. How do we bridge that tension? How do we start to move forward?
Big question, lots of parts to it. I'm going to start by just talking a little bit about the questions that pertain for teachers of color, and then carry that over to leaders of color. And these are teachers of color whom you're recruiting in to prepare as principals. We've just done a study at Learning Policy Institute about recruiting and retaining teachers of color. And one of the interesting things is that we're recruiting teachers of color at a much higher rate. That is also true of principals of color, but we are not retaining them at the same rate. And particularly African American teachers are leaving at a much higher rate. To a lesser extent, that's also true for Latinx teachers, and same issues are occurring with principals. So there's a few things that come up to the surface. One is just being sure that there's a lot of social discourse about caring about having a diverse teaching and leadership workforce, but quite often it's not accompanied by the money to be sure that young people, or whatever part of their career they're doing this, have the resources to get well trained and are well mentored. So in fact, people of color come into teaching, and this is also true into the principalship, with less opportunity to get the training. Many come in through alternative pathways or backdoor pathways, and they are 2 to 3 times more likely to leave if they come in that way, because the skills and the tools were not made available to them. And it's a question, what can you afford? But we do need to, we need to resource. If we care about this, we need to resource it. Same thing with mentoring. So, well mentored, both principals and teachers stay at 2 times the rate of those who are not mentored. So I don't know what your program design is, but I would be wanting you to think about how to carry forward some kind of support system after people get in the job as well as before they get there, even if it's a network. And some of those can be affinity group networks, so that as they go into jobs, principals of color have opportunities to network both with their cohort as a whole, but also with their cohort of principals of color who may be in similar contexts or have other ways by which people can support each other. And then, of course, the other thing that predicts the turnover is the working conditions in the places that people go, because quite often people of color want to be in the settings where there are concentrations of students of color and in poverty. And then, of course, the working conditions are less good there, the resources are less adequate there. We need to recognize that that's going to require both those of us who can flagging that to districts about their obligations to address those issues, but also providing additional networking and supports and mentoring and coaching for the people who are in that setting to help them succeed and survive there. And I think that in some of the, and I noticed that you're Danforth funded for your program, so I don't know whether you have all these features, but it'd be a good thing if you don't get the capacity to follow people in and construct these other supports, that you let the Danforth Foundation know about that. So that
the foundation we do have a support. It's more of, I think it's more of a balanced support. The white counterparts that come into the program. Our leaders of color, we recruit and retain the highest amount of leaders of color in the state for our principal program. It's more of how do we.
I think this is being recorded, so we need to talk to the line.
Oh. The balance that I'm looking forward is how do we move forward with the cohort as a whole, working with our leaders of color as well as the white counterparts that come into the program, who seem to still be working with a very, their equity lens is higher than most. I mean, we're very specific about equity. That's how we recruit individuals who come into our program. It's very, very important to our program.
But you were about to say they are you.
Well,
Let's hear the rest of that sentence.
So, and this is probably the portion where I feel, where I forgive my impatience in terms of, I feel that sometimes it's 2018, and that's where I started to say, I still feel that we're hearing, I am the first Latino, or I am the first African American.
There's no easy answer to that one.
Correct.
But
So how do we bridge that tension? How do we move past just that preliminary, I'm going to give you this article on unpacking the white privilege knapsack, and how do we really get into the guts of working on social justice and working on really tackling these issues that are happening in our schools and looking at your privilege and not putting it off or expecting, like our leaders of color, to cover you.
yeah, I think that one of the things that, back to the point I made earlier about experience in education, it's a good thing to read articles about unpacking the knapsack and so on, and to talk about it, but it's also important to have experiences. And I would think about it, and you may already be doing some of these things, how can leaders be in a community-based setting for a period of time, interning or doing some kind of work where they get to engage with families in a different way, where they get to observe or even go into schools and do observations looking for evidences of privilege and evidences of inequality. I do that with student teachers, and they always find, even in the schools that are talking equity, they always find plenty of representations of the inequalities that may need to be unpacked. And having seen it with their own eyes, sometimes being in clinical experiences where they have to experience with their own over a period of time, it changes the way they can learn. So I would just say that, in university life in general, we are often we start with the book. The book is a good place to start, and the conversation, but we need to figure out how to change the experience base that people have if we want them to get a different, deep frame of reference for the work. And we've got somebody here and there.
Hello, I'm Betty Luke.
Hi.
I'm a community advisor to the Wing Luke Museum. I'm a diversity trainer to teachers for 35 years, and I've had opportunity to train in 36 different states. One thing that keeps coming up, and it's related to what you were talking here, is that in terms of mainstream and white privilege, and how do you reach not just the mainstream teachers in education, but how do we teach them to be allies? We so individually talk about awareness, but we need to build in teaching mainstream people to be allies and support, so students of color don't drop out the education system.
Yeah. I think it's appropriate, where you feel it is appropriate in your context, to be clear that a program of preparation for teachers or leaders is about teaching and leading for social justice, and starting by unpacking that and what it means to be able to be a person of conscience in that work, to have that as the mission. One of the things that's great about having that as the mission of a program is that if somebody doesn't want to do it, you can say, well, you don't need to be here, you can be somewhere else, but you can be much more explicit about the work that you're doing and why it's important to do that work. And then, as I say, I think we want to give people opportunities both to see and recognize the work that needs to be done in a deeply inequitable society where those inequities are reflected in not only in schools but in the way in which we treat children, particularly children of color, but other marginalized groups of children as well. And then to teach explicit tools for it. I mentioned the book that my student teachers and I wrote called Learning to Teach for Social Justice. They really took up what were the ways in which we were giving them opportunities to learn to teach for social justice. What did they learn by that? And then they pushed us to do more and to go further and to reach further. And I think when you can have that explicit conversation with your students, you can not only help them develop those commitments and tools, but they will help you develop more commitments and tools because starting from that space, they will push you even further and come up with great ideas.
Hi, I'm Lisa Sibbitt. I'm a doc student here at the University of Washington. And my question definitely follows on what several other people have been raising about the needs to prepare teachers from dominant social groups to teach about not just difference, but about power. And maybe this is a follow-up particularly to the question that Sarah posed about needing to protect the needs of students from non-dominant social groups at the same time as promoting the learning of students from dominant social groups. And I've seen these dynamics play out both in K-12 classrooms and in teacher education programs, where the teacher candidates of color need to be, to a certain extent, protected from the, or not necessarily, it doesn't have to be race, but any sort of dominant and non-dominant access of identity. So the concern that keeps coming up for me is about how when we, and I've experienced this myself, that when we teach about difference, oftentimes well-meaning liberal learners, like the many well-meaning liberal learners in the Pacific Northwest, sort of feel like, cool, I've done it, I'm a good white person, and I am now a social justice warrior, but as Renee was bringing up earlier, they might be so woke that they can't sleep, they're not effective. Or, so like an example is, well, I'm just thinking about in this particular area, we have such a liberal political environment, and yet we have some of the most segregated schools in the country. We have totally inequitable funding structures, regressive tax systems. And so you would sort of think that our liberal, well-meaning, anti-racist ideology would lead to sort of better social outcomes than we actually have in this community. And we have huge homelessness problems, shocking corporate tax breaks, and so I guess my concern is that sort of preparing people to think about difference doesn't get you far enough, right? And in fact can actually make people think that they've sort of discharged their responsibility and now we don't need to think about this anymore because like I'm woke, I care about anti-racism, and yet no change is actually being affected. And I wonder if you could, you've sort of already been talking about this, and so maybe you could just say, I already answered that, but.
Well, first of all, I'm glad that you're talking about it because it's really important. And I think there's woke, and then there's woke more, and then there's woke more. I mean, there's levels of woke. And there are all these levels of inequality. I mean, our social structure is unequal. We have, as Gloria Latson-Miller's put it, we are aggressively neglecting our children. So the poverty levels, the homelessness, the trauma, the adverse conditions under which we are allowing children to live in this country, are extraordinary and much worse than they were, by the way, in the 60s and 70s. Because when people woke up that time and did some things, the War on Poverty, Great Society, childhood poverty dropped in half in the 1960s. From about 27% to about 14% just in one decade. Continued along at that rate. Of course, Reagan pulled out all those programs and it shot back up to where it is now. It's almost 1 in 4. So we are in worse shape in this country than we were on almost every equality indicator back in the 60s and 70s. In 1975, for example, Black, white, and Latino young people who had graduated from high school went to college at exactly the same rate That was never true before, it has not been true since. And one of the things that I think is important as people think about these other broader issues, first of all, a lot of people don't feel like they can make a difference. First, a lot of people don't know all the stuff you just said about how the society is structuring its investments and its organization of people to be together. Second of all, when people do know something about it, they often feel unempowered to do anything about it. It's too big for me. I'm not operating in that political framework. I'm teaching in a school, or I'm doing whatever I'm doing. And I think everybody has their own contributions to make. So one answer to that is, it's great to be sure that people are woke and that they should at least, minimally be voting and, getting other people to vote on issues. I don't think everybody can do everything, but wherever you are planted, you should do the most you can do in that space to push the context further and further and further towards equality. So it's not enough to have the attitudes, you've got to have the actions. But I think for some people, those actions will be very much within the space that they're. For others, they will be able to and want to reach towards the broader political issues in our society. And we should make sure that people know what's going on and give them pathways, if they choose to take it, to get engaged in that kind of work at that level to address it. And at minimum, to be able to talk about it effectively with others, including students. What is going on? How does it come out looking this way? And really tackling it. I mentioned earlier, I sent the prayer up for Evelyn Jenkins-Gunn, who was one of these wonderful teachers that one of my kids got to encounter. She single-handedly detracked the high school that she was in. I was able to send one of my kids to that high school, and it was the only place that they were able to go where there was a completely detracked school. It may be that's your garden, that's where your work is. It may not be changing the way that the government of Washington State allocates funding to schools. But you got to keep talking about that so that somebody else will take up that issue. And part of being woke is being vocal.
Hello. I want to thank you so much for coming. Really appreciate your presence here. My name is Daphne Blanca-Debaca. I'm an associate professor here. I have two follow-up questions to different things that have been mentioned. Like Lisa, I want to follow up on Sarah's question. So that's the first, which is, in your response to Sarah's question, you raised all the wonderful work being done on the curricular front. And yet, like Lisa said, sometimes it's more about the dynamics. So I'm wondering what you can comment on specifically related to how we better prepare teachers and others to address the tensions and dynamics, because there's skills involved in that, even though these are unfolding processes. So that's the first question. The second
I'm going
is...
to need you to say more about that so I can really understand it.
Sure. The idea that we address, as Sarah mentioned, the tensions of such disparate hate that is cultivated and learned in this white supremacist context that is so empowered right now, how to deal with that in classrooms at the same time as making sure that students of color that their needs are being met simultaneously. It's not only about curriculum or having the right curriculum in place. There's a deep skill set that's needed because these are complex social interactions. And so I'm wondering if you can comment on how we not only have the right but have a set of ideas and processes and experiences, but how we also build on the skills to facilitate that. Does that clarify?
Yep, it's very helpful.
And on the second is just if you can follow up on the tensions. I can entirely see what you were saying about how a Spanish for native speakers class would result in tracking with unintended consequences. I'm wondering if you could say something about how we can still support native language maintenance or other special groupings that support students' identities
Right.
without the unintended consequences.
Right.
Thank
Well,
you.
let me just answer the second one first, because that's easier. We kept the Spanish for Native Speakers class, but we just were mindful that we had to do some other jiggling of the schedule to enable that not to drive a tracking system that kept Latino kids, separate from the African American kids for the whole day. So we didn't change that, but we work with it. But I think what happens in schools a lot of times is people don't think about it. Like they'll track one thing, and then it drives a set of decisions that run through the whole schedule. And people aren't woke when it comes to looking at what that means about who's together. And I think this is really important. Having kids together in classrooms is just really, really important. And we are doing badly at that, both because of school segregation, and thankfully there are moves back on the agenda to take up some issues around integration, but also within schools to make sure that there are those experiences. My son, who's a doctoral student right now, just did a wonderful study looking at the GSS data, looking at what predicts bias on the part of workers. And it turns out that, you won't be surprised, the more black people were in the workplace, the more bias was reduced among the co-workers, the white co-workers. The same thing was true of their neighborhoods. The more people moved into the neighborhoods, the more the bias was reduced. And so just, we got to deal with the issue that people have to be together in part. Obviously, the deep skills that you talked about, that doesn't solve the problem. It sometimes exacerbates the problems in the short run because, people come from the places they come from with the attitudes that they have. And it is a challenge. I think there are some organizations like Facing History that have really done a lot of deep work around the skill set that teachers need to have and can master to manage conversations that can be challenging conversations that allow you to deal with kids who may come with prejudices and biases, as well as kids who may have been the victims of or the targets of various kinds of discrimination and bias that are being raised up. So, I don't know that I can give you like a list of do X, Y, Z, and W, but there are people who have done really important work on the training that is helpful for teachers in doing that. The other thing that I think is important, one way into this is I think history is an important thing. A lot of people don't know the history of what, enslavement and, you've got people running around who say there was no Holocaust and, there was no shooting at Sandy Hook and there was no slavery in the United States. You get the textbooks with the happy slaves, hoeing the field and so on. So for elementary teachers at least, and for history teachers, I think just, giving people access to history is a piece of it. The other piece that I think is interesting is that if you look at history, it wasn't as though all white people were actively involved in either enslaving black people or promoting the slave trade. Most states were non-slave. Most white people were poor and many were sharecropping themselves in that era or later immigrants. Many abolitionists were of all backgrounds and fighting that fight. I think it's important for young people and older people to see the examples of those people of conscience who were engaged in the battles from the very beginning. Many gave their lives for those battles, whether you go back to the fight against slavery and the abolition movement, or you go into other places. Because I think otherwise what ends up happening in the discourse, it becomes like a labeling process. it's like, if you're white, you were responsible for all of this happening, and if you're black, you were the subject of it, which of course is also not true, because there were African Americans who were not enslaved, and so it's a complex history in which we don't sometimes locate the burden on the 1% who owned the plantations and who secured the constitutional provisions that made African Americans 3/5 of a person and all of that. And Jim Crow was created because black and white workers were coming together, and they were about to overthrow the plantation system, the landed gentry. It was becoming clear in the Reconstruction movement that people who had been marginalized were coming together to actually demand something much more equitable and to change the way of the South. And Jim Crow was created to keep people apart so that they wouldn't have the chance to activate politically. So I think the discourse has to hold up the examples, particularly for young white students who are confused about how to think about themselves racially and what it means, that there is also a power of privilege that allows you to be an activist on behalf of the welfare of everyone. And if you can pose those identities for people, young people are looking for identity, and if they can see identities that allow them to move forward positively, many of them will resonate to that and will take up that identity instead of the skinhead identity. And those identities are not well rooted in young people quite often. They just need an opportunity to see what their identity can be, and they'll take up whatever in the environment. So we have to provide things in the environment that allow them to construct positive, productive, multicultural identities.
Dr. Darling-Hammond, thank you very much for your presentation and this extended conversation. I'm Margaret Barrett and head of the School of Music at the University of Queensland in Australia. I've appreciated your presentation enormously, and it's raised some issues for me. You spoke about the need for social and emotional education, and you also spoke about the need to provide our students and our student teachers with experiences that they might not otherwise have. As a music educator, I'm aware of the rich legacy of the arts in being able to contribute to this. Indeed, Dewey wrote about art as experience and the ways in which we might learn from that. Paradoxically, with that knowledge, we are in a curriculum environment in which the arts are being further and further rejected from the curriculum. In Australia, in teacher education, an early childhood primary teacher is lucky if they get 4 hours of music education across 4 years of teacher education. So I see this incredible potential and resource that is being ignored, marginalised, and I would appreciate your thoughts on how we might create a greater awareness and reinstate the arts as a very powerful means of learning, not only for our children, but also for our teacher educators.
I love that. So, full disclosure, I was a music major in college. I had sort of a joint major in music and African American studies and a minor in English, and I did not teach music because it's so hard. My hat is off to you. You have to be able to play every instrument and train the kids in every instrument and create bands and choirs and orchestras and run around from school to school. So, first of all, the music teachers. I know how to do the reading and writing stuff. I'll go in and train the music teacher. And, it is so important, both as a mode of expression and as part of the way in which we learn and so on. Okay. After this, we're going to take one more question, Jim said. So it's very important. One of the things that came to mind as you were talking about this is I would encourage those who structure teacher education in Australia to take a hard look at Finland, where music is every day. Music is, you cannot become a primary teacher in Finland if you cannot play the piano. Along with being, very academically able and, caring about children and doing actually a research exam in which you have to interpret educational research as part of, you also have to be able to be musical. And one of the interesting things about the brain science work is that we are cognitively wired more extensively and in ways that are very important for lots of other things academically and otherwise, by engaging in music and that symbol system, by engaging in arts, by engaging in the learning of other languages, which are other symbol systems, and by physical activity, which also makes us smarter and better wired in our brains. They did an experiment with they found out on autopsies of Alzheimer's patients that people who had more than one language, their Alzheimer's showed up 5 years later than for people who had only one language, because they had better brain wiring. They had more stuff there to rely on. And the same thing has been found with, the wiring that comes about with music, for example. So it is important on so many levels for personal expression, for the way in which we think and perform and so on. In fact, one of the things about Finland that I wonder is that I spent time there, the kids are speaking 2 or 3 languages from the very beginning, and they're almost all different symbol systems. Like they're taking multiple languages in elementary school as well as their native language, so they're typically speaking English, Finnish, and either Arabic or Russian or something. So they're doing all that. They're doing music every single day. And every hour in the hour, they go outside for 15 minutes. The little kids put their snowsuits on and they run around. And so their brains are always woke, in the sense of, ready to learn. Because of all of that activity. So there is a way of thinking about education that Australia and the US have been kind of losing the understanding of why a whole person education that takes all of our expressive and receptive abilities and develops them is so important for so many reasons. I forget what your question was, but I just want to say, music is really important. You've got to figure out ways to help people understand. There is a huge literature on this too, that is definitely showing how music has many, many other contributions to academic achievement and to a variety of other healthy developmental aspects. So I'm glad to talk with you more about that. Wait, one more.
Hi, my name is Andres Tendal, and I'm a public school administrator retired, so I'm out of the language, but I do have a question here. And the issue is, this is important work. And if you were to give some insights from yourself in terms of the mindset that it takes to be authentic and to be able to interrogate your implicit bias as we engage in these emotional and sometimes traumatizing things. Thank you.
I'm glad that Tyrone is here and others who are going to answer some of these questions later. The mindset is a key issue. And one of the reasons I am very bullish on explicit, embedded social emotional learning opportunities is that it does help people raise these things that are otherwise underground to the surface with kids throughout the grades. I don't think it's something you do in first grade and then you're done. I think it's got to be embedded throughout, and it can be in classrooms in the way elementary teachers teach, but it can also be in advisories in middle and high schools and in classrooms that content teachers teach also. But these issues of mindsets and implicit bias can be, actually raised up. And one of the things about the mindset is first you've got to realize that it exists. You've got to be able to kind of name it. You got to understand that everybody has it in some way. We all have implicit biases of some sort because of the way the human mind works and categorizes and so on, and some are much more dangerous than others. And then having practice and being able to recognize and reflect on the ways in which we deal with our biases. I'll admit one to you. I have a really hard time when I'm teaching distinguishing young blonde women in my classroom who have long hair and look like California girls to me who grew up on the East Coast. I just, didn't have an experience of, so I recognize that I have that challenge, and I spend a lot of time at the beginning of class making sure that I see those students, learn their names, understand who they are, because I don't want to be calling them each other's names, 4 weeks into the term. And all of us have various, because of our experiences from what we are familiar with and what we have heard in the media and environment. So I think it's important that everybody, kind of have that recognition. There is, of course, very good implicit bias training that one can activate, and I think it's a really good thing to do for all educators, and really have that opportunity to reflect together from that kind of a framework. But the mindset that you started with, the mindset has to be that we are all growing and learning every day. The whole purpose of life is to grow and to learn. And the purpose is not to be a perfect person who never has anything to learn. The purpose is to grow and learn, and this is a critically important area. We can't marginalize the work on human relationships that is central to growing and learning, in schools especially. And so as leaders, it's very important for leaders to bring that in to the center of the work. That is the way in which we relate to each other, the way in which we continue to build our knowledge of each other. Teachers learn a lot of tools for how to help kids bring their experiences and who they are into the classroom so you can build on it and so on. We kind of need to do that as well for the educators in the educator workforce. One of the ways to reduce implicit bias is for people to get to know each other better. So, part of it is also just that relational work that we do in a context in which the expectation is that we will come to be able to know and appreciate each other. So thank you for asking that.
Thank you. Linda, for whom I am deeply and will be eternally indebted and grateful, although I've asked her for my series for Teachers College Press to do her biography, her journey biography for me. She didn't say no. And she told me to come back to her later. I was concerned about the energy it took and she kept telling me I can go on. So she exemplified and epitomized the wonderful teacher that she is. And the energy that she gave was enormous. You have time to, let's get